Уважаеми колеги,
Dear colleagues, after the quite nicely long lunch break, I suggest we get down to business, the discussion of the topics for the afternoon panel. We will start with countering illegal content online and optimizing cybersecurity. Europol Cybercrime Center and the EU Internet Referral Unit. In the time when digitalization occupies more and more the everyday life of people, when the digital connectivity is vital, we see more and more new challenges related to online space. These challenges in the security sector cross borders and create new possibilities for generating threats to our security. It is my pleasure that with us today are two commissioners who are in charge of these two matters. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Madame Gabriel and Commissioner King. After their speeches, we will hear also Rob Wainwright from Europol. Maria Gabriel, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Tsvetanov. Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to take the floor today at this second meeting of the Joint Parliamentary Scrutiny Group in Sofia. In this joint panel, we will discuss on one hand the countering of illegal content online and on the other hand the cybersecurity. These topics are intrinsically related and I will formulate it in the following short sentence. Let's make internet secure and safe place for our citizens. Digital technologies develop quite fast, so starting from today, all our decisions in this respect have to be based on mutual cooperation, and today's meeting is a good example of it. And I will describe now the measures the Commission is taking on these two matters. First, regarding countering illegal content. On the 1st of March, the European Commission published a recommendation for countering illegal content online. This was an additional and a first step. I would like just to remind you that in September 2017, the European Commission published a communication on countering illegal content. This was the first signal sent by the Commission, and we expressed clearly our expectations. Yes, we have dialogues based on voluntary principles. We have also EU Internet Forum and the Code of Conduct. But today what we want is the platforms to respond more quickly and more efficiently. A large amount of the illegal content stays online for more than 24 hours. And we know that in the first 1 or 2 hours after the posting that this content has the strongest impact. Something else we want the platforms to do. What is illegal outside the online space is illegal also online. And we need a clear definition at European Union level in the European legislation. I mean, one of the cruelest crimes that exists, that's the sexual exploitation of children, alongside with instigation to terrorism. Therefore, the European Commission today cannot assume and agree with the use of Internet for such harmful purposes, because our final objective is to protect the European citizens and provide a secure environment for them. I will mention a few details. Our suggestion is quite balanced in the recommendation. For the first time, the recommendation stipulates what are the procedures for reporting and taking actions. We have also new elements that need to be emphasized. We have defined for the first time the term trusted flaggers. because the online platforms cannot and are not in position to define what is legal and what is illegal. The trusted flaggers allow a third party having the required expertise to identify and inform the platforms about illegal content. Those trusted flaggers may be specialized organizations who work against the crimes based on hatred. Recently, we had a meeting in Brussels with the trusted flaggers in order to discuss how we can improve the current system. And I would like to thank the Europol's Internet unit for their work and for their valuable contribution at the meeting mentioned. This was the first meeting where the trusted flaggers of member states had the opportunity to meet. For the first time, those who work on the terrorist propaganda met those who fight against illegal content relating to sexual exploitation of children and instigation to terrorism. This was the first meeting of its kind at European level. Now some data. The Europol Internet Unit assessed a total of 42,060 illegal cases of contact, and 714 decisions were made for deleting this contact. 76% of the contact within the Euro Internet Forum and up to 93% of the illegal content was deleted. I can only congratulate Europol for these results and encourage them to continue the good cooperation with us, because thus we will be more successful. I have a few concerns to share as well. They relate to the procedures applicable to small platforms in the context of fighting illegal content. One of the most common phenomena is that large platforms have both technical and human resources to quickly delete illegal content online. However, what happens is that this deleted content immediately flows into smaller platforms that do not have the required capacity. Therefore, we encourage them to have more common databases and to cooperate. I have mentioned that our recommendation is well balanced. It emphasizes how important it is to have transparency, to have a definition of illegal content. It sends a strong message of intensified cooperation with the police authorities and to have more and more trusted flaggers. We do know that the major values of the EU are in the basis of each and every project we have, and the freedom of speech is one of the main values of the EU. We need to guarantee them. Thus, the citizens will be able to send a signal immediately when some content has been deleted, has been removed from the online space, if it was not justified. In this way, we are trying to avoid the over-removal. Commissioner King will give you more details on the aspect of fighting terrorism. We all know how easy it is today for everyone to post a video on terrorist matters, and this is unsafe for the European citizens. This is why we have a specific section of the recommendation dedicated to terrorism. We have seen that there are various measures taken by the platforms and their business. And today, my message to you is that this is not the end of the process. We need to make it possible for the platforms to adapt to the rules specified in the recommendation. and we need to keep open our possibility to continue working, including by means of legislative acts. On the second topic for discussion today, I would like to dwell on one of the topics, the technical aspects of the recommendation on countering illegal content online. In other words, the use of automatic tools. We want the platforms to take specific and proportional measures. This means automatic tools that would more efficiently detect and delete illegal content online. As a commissioner in charge of digital economy and society, I'm only too glad of the fact that we are using more and more efficient technologies. Unfortunately, this is accompanied with posting of videos instigating to terrorism or showing sexual exploitation of children. We do realize that all these technologies, in most cases, belong to 2 or 3 companies jointly. The so-called hashes or fingerprints, which maintain the filters against the reappearance of the same contact, are accessible for only a small number of large internet companies. Therefore, I would like to send again my message. Let's cover as many platforms as possible with our measures, with 2 objectives: illegal content not to be moved from one platform to another, and on the other hand, to support the smaller companies, which in most cases are the victims of malicious intent people. There are many such cases reported by the media. Regarding identification of photos as illegal or shocking or showing violence, if we want the automatic tools to work in our favor in our fight against illegal content, we need to provide for efficient safeguards. In other words, the automatic tools need to be monitored by human resources in order to avoid wrong decisions which infringe the right to freedom of expression. Again, in the context of countering illegal content, we need to have always preliminary impact assessments, and we will continue doing so in the European Commission with the joint efforts of all parties involved in order to find out how to achieve more efficient results and how this control by humans can be effected. And the second part of this meeting, the cybersecurity, it is perhaps one of the biggest challenges we are facing today. What is more, this is in a situation where our society is undergoing digital transformation, depend more and more on ICT. Cyber attacks cross borders. Therefore, I'm convinced that cooperation and coordination are the key factors to success in order for us to be able to overcome this challenge. Of course, first of all, we need cooperation among the different parties in order to improve the cybersecurity in the whole EU. Cooperation should be between national authorities, but also among the national and European Union institutions. And I'm happy I can reconfirm that the cooperation between Europol and ENISA is successful. These are the 2 most important agencies regarding cybersecurity. This is why I rely a lot also on the European Parliament. We had a suggestion made in the autumn of 2017 inviting the Parliament to do as soon as possible the necessary to give operational capacity to ENISA, alongside with more human resources and a bigger budget in order to have added value from the cooperation. The challenge is that we have to operate with limited resources, but they have to be used most efficiently, namely for this reason. This is why we need to further encourage cooperation and avoid duplication of tasks. Definitely, cooperation is one of the first steps, but also we are responsible for coordinating our common efforts. Coordination is very important in case of large-scale problems on the internet. This is why the Commission, in the package on cybersecurity, presented the so-called blueprint actions in response of large-scale attack on the internet. I rely on the member states that they will make this blueprint mechanism operational as soon as possible. I congratulate Europol for developing a protocol for cooperation with the law enforcement bodies in the field of cybersecurity. We need a common approach and fast response in case of attacks. Therefore, Europol and ENISA will soon sign a memorandum of understanding with the European Defence Agency and the European Rapid Response Unit, the so-called CERT-EU, in order to improve the cooperation. What is very important for us is to facilitate the proper exchange of information at European level and to invest in teams able to respond in case of attacks in order to guarantee the information security of the EU. Europol and ENISA create various opportunities, but we need to support their efforts in order to increase the level of confidence and cooperation at European level. I hope in the course of the discussion I will be able to provide you with more information about another suggestion by the Commission for establishing a center of competence and excellence at European level. We would like to invest in human resources and in technologies. The purpose of this proposal of ours is in each one of the member states and centrally in Brussels, such a center to be established where Europe, by means of investments and expertise, can demonstrate its capacity and abilities in this respect. Currently, a pilot project is underway for collecting project proposals until the end of April. The funding comes from the program Horizon 2020. We expect all the member states to apply for the project in order to make all the centers operational until the end of next year. Your contribution will be invaluable, for example, by giving ideas how such centers of excellence can help us improve cybersecurity. In conclusion, I would like to reaffirm again that the European Commission views very seriously the problem with the illegal content online, cybersecurity. About the illegal content online, our recommendations are not binding for the time being. We want to give an opportunity to the countries to apply the described measures, and I will be glad to hear from you on the basis of your experience and expertise what cases you have had with terrorist content as well. This is to emphasize once more how important cooperation is for our efficient work. And this is something that Commissioner King and myself are working together on. This is one of the major tools of the European Commission, cooperation and coordination, which offer efficient measures. The online world opens unique possibilities for everybody. Digital technologies offer possibilities for growth and innovations. On the other hand, however, they give also a lot of threats and potential problems. So we need to be always alert to be able to protect our society in this developing environment. We are the persons who bear the responsibility to protect our citizens both online and offline. Thank you.
Thank you. Let us all thank the Commissioner on Digital Economy, Commissioner Maria Gabriel. And now I give the floor to Commissioner King, Commissioner for Security Union. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair, joint chairs, and thank you very much for putting this subject on the agenda so prominently, because Europol plays an important role, which we're going to discuss, but also because the subject itself is so important. As my colleague, Commissioner Gabriel, just concluded, we live in an ever more connected world, not just computers and phones now, but homes, hospitals, governments, electricity grids, the news we read, and soon even the cars we drive around in, our fridges, our washing machines, and in some cases, I'm told, even our rubbish bins are going online. And as that ever more connected world grows in importance and complexity, it brings huge benefits, but it also brings risks and threats, and we need to work together to mitigate and manage those in order to be able to get the benefits without having to live through some of the downside. One part of the downside is cybercrime. And cybercrime has been, unfortunately, booming in recent years, growing very, very fast. I think that last year there was kind of a step change in public awareness about the scale of this problem. In part, that was because of the very big attacks, WannaCry and NotPetya, which affected so many countries, over 150 countries, and affected and spilled over into many different parts of life. But also, I think it was because of the drip, drip, drip effect that many people have experienced personally of cybercrime. So last year, Europe was hit by more than 4,000 ransomware attacks on average per day. 4 in 5 European companies experienced at least one cybersecurity incident. In some countries, half of all crimes are now recorded as cybercrimes. Some surveys suggest that well over 40% of consumers have been impacted by cybercrime in the last 12 months. So it's very direct. It affects people's lives. And it has a huge cumulative economic drag on growth across our economies. Again, the estimates vary, but we do have some concrete figures. Card fraud in the Eurozone amounted to some 1.5 billion euros. 2/3 of that card fraud took place without the card being present. So it was cyber crime-enabled card fraud. So that there's a growing awareness of the importance of the economic impact. But I think there's also an awareness that some of the impact isn't economic. Some of these attacks and interference can go beyond economic into the political sphere. They can be direct use of cyber means for aggressive purposes. We've seen that in our member states as long ago as 2007 in Estonia, all the way through to cyber attack in France during the presidential elections in 2017. But there are also more and more cyber attacks which seek to manipulate behavior or cast questions over democratic processes, elections, or the functioning of democratic institutions. And I think it's that combination of factors that has put this subject so front and center in citizens' concerns, and why it's so important that we together need to organize to try and deal with some of these threats. As we do so, we need to remember the values that we are protecting. There is no trade-off between safety and fundamental values online. The policies that we pursue in this area must respect and protect our fundamental values. As Commissioner Gabriel said, last September, we came forward with a package of proposals designed to reinforce cybersecurity around 3 pillars of building our resilience, building deterrence, and boosting international cooperation. Maria, spoke about some of the key elements of building our resilience, the work to reduce the impact of cyber attacks and protect ourselves better from such attacks in the first place. The other side of the coin, which is very important to remember, is reinforcing deterrence. We need to create real and credible disincentives for those who might think about attacking us. That means increasing their chances of getting caught and attaching some severe penalties to committing these cyber attacks. The problem is that at the moment, criminals and indeed other malicious actors are able to get away with these attacks too easily. It is too difficult to trace and hold people to account, in particular for cyber criminal attacks. So in order to build a more credible deterrence, we need to have more effective detection, traceability, investigation, and prosecution for these crimes. From our side, the Commission wants to propose different ways of creating conditions that will give law enforcement the possibility to pursue and prosecute these crimes. We need to make sure that we're doing everything we can with you at a national level and at the European level to give law enforcement the tools they need to keep us safe in the cyber domain. We've already collectively adopted directives on attacks against information systems and on stopping child sexual abuse. In addition, we've proposed new legislation to combat fraud committed through non-cash payments that I was talking about a moment ago. We welcome the fact that the Member States and the Council have adopted a general approach on those proposals earlier this month, and I look forward to taking those negotiations forward, and I hope finalising them very quickly with the help of the European Parliament. With cybercrime, the offender, the victims, and the infrastructure used to commit the crime are very often located in different countries. So there are some real challenges in following up such crimes, accessing electronic evidence. From the Commission side, we will come forward next month with a legislative proposal on obtaining electronic evidence for criminal investigations and prosecutions for cybercrime, terrorism, and other forms of serious criminal activity. Because cybercrime, as Commissioner Gabriel said, knows no boundaries, we need to have a joined-up approach, not only at the policy level, but also at the operational level, with stronger cooperation between our different law enforcement authorities. And here, Europol, I don't want to steal Rob's thunder, but Europol have played an absolutely key role over recent years and are now, I think, internationally recognised as a centre of excellence in tackling cybercrime. EC3, the European Cybercrime Centre, has enabled us to focus on cooperation and outreach to all of the relevant actors in this field. As most of the cybercrime threat surface, most of what we're talking about, is run by the private sector, Europol have also facilitated really effective public-private cooperation against some of these threats. What's increasingly clear is that it's not possible to confront cybercrime effectively if the various communities do not work together. This need for cooperation is, I think, reflected in the very way that Europol works and in the structures of the Cybercrime Centre, the diversity of the membership of the centre, and by the strong links that it's created with business, with industry, and with a whole range of cyber security experts. Of course, on these threats and on cybercrime in particular, we need effective international cooperation. And I'm very glad to say that Europol provides technical and forensic support to a number of international investigations which have yielded some really important results, including last year the takedown of 2 really big criminal dark web marketplaces. Europol has quickly established an excellent track record in the provision of valuable support to national and international investigations, a fact which is confirmed in all the feedback. I'm saying that to save Rob some of his, to save him his blushes, because they really do an outstanding job in this area. But as the threat keeps evolving and increasing, law enforcement capacities also need to evolve to keep pace with this fast-changing challenge. So we need to step up cooperation and sharing of expertise and reinforce, in particular, cyber forensics and detection capabilities. And I think that Europol there can play a key role in helping the member states, in particular the member states who are not as advanced as others. Building on the work they've done, we need Europol to become a real centre of expertise that every EU member state's law enforcement automatically turn to when they need assistance in cybercrime investigations. Cybersecurity isn't only about countering ransomware attacks, botnets, DDoS attacks, and catching the perpetrators of child sexual abuse offences, vitally important as all that is. Digital technology and infrastructure is also used extensively, as Commissioner Gabriel was saying, by terrorists and others who seek to cause us harm and to disrupt our societies, to spread their pernicious and evil propaganda. Daesh, in particular, have been very good at using the online world to spread their hateful, violent messages, spreading fear and division. And I'm afraid there is a direct link between some of this illegal terrorist radicalizing material and some of the attacks that we've experienced on our streets in Europe, particularly some of the attacks last year by homegrown, self-radicalizing individuals, part of whose radicalization was driven by online content. So that's one of the reasons why, as part of the proposals that Commissioner Gabriel was talking about on online content, we have a particular and specific focus on illegal terrorism content. And a bit like the content on child sexual exploitation, this is a particular set of horrible content that we think we can and should do more about. There are some difficult issues that Commissioner Gabriel referred to when it comes to forms of hate speech and how you balance there the fundamental values of freedom of speech. There are some big issues which we're seeking to start a debate about around fake news. Those are challenges that we take very seriously and which we're going to continue to work on. But to a degree, they are distinct from the category of illegal terrorism content. Because when it comes to that, we know what it is. We have definitions, both at the European level and at the national level. And we know that if we find it offline, we will declare it illegal and we will prohibit it and pursue and prosecute people who spread it. So the same logic needs to apply online. And that was the focus of the recommendations that we came forward the other day with, that said that we want the platforms to work with us, all the platforms to work with us, to take down such content when it is referred to them by law enforcement within 1 hour. To use automated means more to spot such content, to take it down quickly, to stop it going up in the first place, if possible, to flag it when it has been taken down so that it cannot be uploaded again, because that is one of the problems that we have. The material is taken down and it's uploaded again. That the big platforms need to help and support the smaller platforms, because the other problem we have is a problem of migration. The material that is attacked and taken down on the big platforms migrates or comes up and reappears on smaller platforms who need our help and support, not just of the industry, but also actually of the member states' authorities as well. And that all platforms should work more with law enforcement so that when material is identified as illegal terrorist content and is taken down, that is systematically notified to law enforcement and I hope to Europol as well, so that they have an information database that they can use to go after the people who are trying to spread such content. We have set out those concrete recommendations, steps that we believe can and should be taken now. And we have said, as my colleague Commissioner Gabriel pointed out, that we will continue to try and pursue those objectives on a voluntary basis, because that's the quickest way of making progress. But if we don't get the progress we need in the next months, and we've said we will review the situation in 3 months' time, so that is end of May. If we don't get the progress we need, then we reserve the right to look again at whether we need to regulate or legislate in this area, recognizing that that won't be simple, but that we absolutely need to take action on these issues. So once again, chairs, thank you very much for putting this subject on the agenda and giving us the opportunity to discuss it and have this exchange today. We need the support of all of the member states' parliaments and the European Parliament as we take forward this work, which I think is absolutely crucial to the security of our citizens.
Thank you, Commissioner King. Now I give the floor to Rob Wainwright, who will present to us the Europol activities in the fighting cybercrime.
Thank you, Mrs. Svitanov, and let me just reflect briefly on the excellent, following the excellent interventions of Commissioner Gabriel and Commissioner King. As they said, Europol is actively involved in this area, cybercrime being such a frontline issue in our efforts to contain threats on internal security. We have the European Cybercrime Centre. It's running about 200 high-profile investigations a year. As Commissioner King says, I think it's become one, if not the leading international law enforcement centres now for fighting cybercrime. You see the quality of the investigations, the level of complexity going up every year. We depend a lot on bringing the very best cyber investigators together in a unique task force that we have at the heart of EC3. This includes non-European agencies. Indeed, the FBI, for example, is very often a leader of many of our very highest profile investigations, but also the private sector, engaging more with the private sector in this area perhaps than others. The large tech firms such as Microsoft helping us to take down big botnet operations, for example, engaging with the banking sector that very often is in the front line for certain threats at the moment. So, of course, most of our work focused on providing operational support so that we can first identify and then contain the activities of the most dangerous cyber criminal groups in the world. But from the very large-scale information exchange that we are facilitating and the operational work, we also get the basis for very good strategic insight. We can see the trends across all of these operations as to where cybercrime is coming next. And Commissioner King has especially touched on this. The scale is, of course, going up. We see from that in terms of the impact that it's having. Ransomware itself recorded 300,000 victims at least around the world. Most of them were companies, not even single individuals. Data breaches now, in the case of Yahoo, 3 billion users, 3 billion people in the world affected by that data breach finally. That the impact is also increasing in different ways. Last year saw the critical infrastructure of many of our critical services impacted. 80 NHS hospitals in the WannaCry attack, as well as the German rail network, the telecoms operator. In Spain, 50% of all the targets affected by non-Petya ransomware attack in the middle of the year were industrial targets, for example. The Deutsche Telekom network, with almost 1 million of its users affected by a DDoS attack in November 2016 as well. Now, the reason why I think the scale is going up and the impact, I think the capability behind it is certainly getting better. The cyber criminals are becoming better at what they do. They are supported by an infrastructure of cyber criminality on the dark web especially, where some of the largest criminal marketplace forums are trading in hundreds of thousands of different illicit commodities. These are huge underground criminal Amazon places with similar infrastructure, 24/7 helplines, 24-hour guaranteed delivery rates, feedback mechanisms, a catalog that's very technologically easy to use. So it provides the backbone for why we have so much cyber criminality, as does an effective syndication. So the best, most able cyber criminal specialists starting to brigade their work, starting to collaborate rather than compete with each other, and between them, therefore, providing a strong syndicated means to provide a service, a crime as a service to criminal groups. A rising use and exploitation of new technologies such as cryptocurrencies, which has become a principal driver of certain cyber criminal trends. Ransomware today is the #1 malware threat, principally because of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin has allowed those criminals to first demand and receive ransom payments in a virtually anonymous way. And so beyond that, cryptocurrencies are also supporting other forms of cyber criminality. And new threats evolving all the time. WannaCry itself was new because it had for the first time a ransomware attack that had a worm functionality built into it. That's why it spread around the world so quickly. And perhaps most worryingly of all that we are identifying at Europol across the many operations that we're running now, a distinct trend of the last 12 months where there is a blending of cyber criminal capability with that of state actors. So more and more operations, threats that are somehow a mixture of the both, which suggests that state-sponsored cyber criminal activity is either willingly or accidentally being bled into the wider cyber criminal community. Now that's dangerous because it means that some of the very highest capability is now available in a much wider domain. And I think that's what concerns us perhaps the most at the moment. From all of that, a trend towards more aggressive and direct targeting of not just governments, but critical services I already mentioned, banking services I mentioned. So a switch from the olden days where you'd have 1 million phishing emails sent out hoping that you have a 1% response rate to a lottery scam, for example, to something that's much more targeted now on the highest profile, the highest net worth individuals, the highest profile organizations, and a much more targeted spear phishing-led targeting of these companies. Meanwhile, our response trends are getting better, and I agree with Commissioner King that last year seemed like a seminal moment, because I'm noticing now in the boardrooms of some of our largest companies a much better awareness even within the last 12 months. But still it's not as good as it should be. We still saw in WannaCry itself that what was in the end quite a simple exploitation of a failure to patch systems, which is, a basic cybersecurity concern, that was catching out even some of the largest companies in the world. So there's still clearly a problem of getting our minimum cybersecurity standards up to the highest level. And despite all the new threats that we're seeing, still 80% of the problem relates to the recycling of old tools. So if we have minimum cybersecurity standards, almost all of the problem is taken care of. And that certainly has to be our first priority. With that in mind, the legislation that is coming this year, so if last year was an important year, this year will certainly be the year of legislative impact because of GDPR and because of also the NIS directive, both of which impose on companies and critical services minimum standards of cybersecurity. And GDPR especially carries a huge fine behind it for those that do not meet those standards or fail to report a cyber security breach. This will have an impact. It certainly will. And over long term, a very positive impact, I believe, of driving up cybersecurity standards. But in the short term, what we might see is an apparent increase in the scale of cybercrime and the number of breaches. It's just that companies are now perhaps being a bit more public and honest with those attacks that are hitting them. And of course, alongside that, our responses have also significantly been enhanced by the legislative and policy action at national level, but mainly in the European space. Both the commissioners reported on the very many steps that we've seen from the European Commission especially, and also the European Parliament in recent years. And all of the things that they mentioned about e-evidence, about encryption, about the emergency protocol for coordinating law enforcement response, something that Commissioner Gabriel mentioned. These are all extremely important in building better levels of response in terms of what they both said, resilience, deterrence, and international cooperation. And for our part at Europol, it's simply that we're here to provide that platform, to act as an international centre so that we can help to investigate the worst excesses of cybercriminality and keep our citizens safe. We are also active, of course, in terms of countering terrorist content online. And as you also heard from the commissioners, this is still a major frontline part of the threat that we face from terrorism. That Daesh's technological capability is certainly higher than we've seen from any terrorist group in the past. We see them also evolving to the responses that we are taking. They're disseminating older material by new means, essentially, as Commissioner Gabriel says, the shift from larger to smaller platforms, social media platforms and forums. The use of Telegram as one social media platform that is perhaps less responsible and less productive in cooperation with us as well. How the propaganda messages has changed, rather encouraging radicalized people to come to Syria and Iraq to join the fight to establish a caliphate, instead to incite and encourage those to stay at home in the West, in Europe, and carry out attacks there. And meanwhile, in terms of our response, the Europol, the EU Internet Referral Unit at Europol, working with its national counterparts to identify and remove tens of thousands of terrorist contents online, but also by taking a more intelligence-led approach to identify how the ecosystem of this terrorist propaganda online works, so that we can have the maximum impact on those accounts that are critical to that ecosystem. So we're really evolving our approach while working with over 80 social media platforms in more than 10 languages and working with our national counterparts. As Commissioner Ging says, the trend in our response, working through the very important mechanism of the EU Internet Forum, which provides the means by which we can hold also industry to account. We're moving towards now means by which we can improve automatic detection capability. And Europol is involved in a pilot project with national units of Belgium, France, and the Netherlands to see how we can coordinate this automatic referral as well. So in the technology-enabled space of crime and terrorism, quickly becoming perhaps the most decisive element of how we all collectively can collaborate to keep our citizens safe in the future. And Europol is certainly pleased to play its part and to support the activities of our member states. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wainwright. Colleagues, now we have the opportunity to hear your contributions. The first speaker is Ms. Borowicz from the Polish Parliament. You have the floor.
Thank you. Dear co-chairman, dear colleagues, cybercrimes are usually a step ahead legal formal structures which are set up for countering it. That is why it is important to have a legal frameworks and practical means of exchange information and data which help us to deal with the possible attacks. And it is clarity and simplicity of procedures that provide us with efficiency in activities and challenges, and we should approach to it. But still, the intellectual and technological capacity of Europe is crucial to provide proper and high standard protection against cybercrimes. Therefore, such agency as Europol is necessary to maintain cooperation in the European Union dimension, but also to enable us a global cooperation with America, India, China, and Russia, and the other third parties. And one of the most challenging tasks in cybersecurity is countering cybercrimes against children, as they are especially detrimental to them, for example, sexual abuse of children. So we are all obliged to protect children against any inappropriate actions and content, and to use any means Europol may provide. As the Polish parliamentarians, we are happy to have an opportunity to work in the format as JPSG, and not only scrutinize, but also to support Europol in its activities in challenging and difficult fields. Благодаря. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I will give the floor to Mr. Dimitriou from Cyprus.
We just covered. It's okay. We don't have any question. Thank you very much.
Беше заявено и затова просто ви обявих.
I've seen your name on the list of speakers. Sorry. Now, Agias Demera, member of the Libe Committee and MEP.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I think this is a very welcome initiative to include the cybercrime issue here. And I'd very much like to raise a couple of points, if I may. First of all, a question for Commissioner King. Well, before the question, I'd like to congratulate you, Commissioner, on launching the recent legislative initiative on interoperability. There are two proposals for regulations on police cooperation, judicial cooperation, asylum, and migration. In the Specialized Committee on Terrorism, I held a discussion, and there was this issue about the European Search Portal, EULISA, and interoperability. There was a very complex question which arose there, which I'd like to ask you about, because if we're to be effective, we need to have legislative proposals along the lines of what I've just been referring to, but we also need a budget. And there are various windows. We have Europol, the entry and exit regulation that will take effect in 2020. We have ETIAS, which is currently going before parliaments, and we then have
the EULISA 3 points, Eurodas, SIS, and VIS. And then on top of that, we'd have to add Interpol and ECRIS. So in order to be effective, what we really need is to ensure that all those databases are interoperable. Commissioner, how quickly can that be done? When will it be possible to achieve such a degree of interoperability? I appreciate this is a very complex issue, but you did give some figures on one previous occasion. What kind of budget are we talking about? Thank you very much. For Maria Gabriel. I'll digress for a moment. We used to work together, of course, side by side. So I just wanted to express my respect, admiration, friendship and affection for Maria. Maria and I, as I say, were working side by side on the visa directive 539, and Spain did grant a visa exemption for Colombia and Peru, and that was also no small measure thanks to her, so thank you very much. Now, as for your new job, I'm sure you'll do an excellent job, just as you did in Parliament. Digital economy, digital society, I'm sure you'll do just as much of an excellent job there too. Now, these are now the questions on Europol. What could be done to improve the capacity that we currently have? Rob has referred to the Cybercrime Centre and the IRU, and I think they have huge potential. Rob has referred to certain issues, and I think it was quite right to raise concerns about cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies are used to fund terrorism. So we're right to be concerned, of course, but cryptocurrencies are also used online in many other ways too. What can we actually do? How can we act in this field? It's a very difficult question, and I'm sure a complex question. I'm sure the answer will be equally complex. Thank you very much.
Благодаря, господин Диаз де Мера.
Thank you, Mr. Diaz de Mera. And now I give the floor to Mr. Talis Cabros from the European Parliament.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. We know that one of the tasks of Europol's Internet Referral Unit is to carry out and support referrals quickly, efficiently, and effectively in close cooperation with the industry. These tasks are carried out by receiving requests from the Member States or through the research for content online. As far as I'm aware of, the referral activity, meaning the reporting of terrorist and extremist online content to the concerned online service provider, does not constitute an enforceable act. Thus, the decision in removal of referred identified terrorist and extremist online content is taken by the concerned service provider and their own responsibility and accountability. Well, I am aware, of course, of the threats, and we have to protect ourselves and fight against them, but wouldn't it be more efficient, transparent and objective if the referrals were made to a judicial authority who, after following a proper criminal investigation, decided that the content is indeed illegal and ordered the online service provider to erase the content? Don't you think that this kind of privatized policing approach leads to a very arbitrary law enforcement by private enterprises on the basis of their terms of reference, which, by the way, they are not in criminal law? And now, if you allow me just 1 minute for a general, very brief comment on security and freedom, something which was asked for this morning in the debate. I'm very much in favor of efficacy, and I think that balance is a nice word to order one's life, but I think that when we speak about security and freedom, we should be able to prioritize. Why this? Because they are not at the same level. Authoritarian regimes prefer security, and they press down rights and freedoms, because security is the main thing to be prosecuted. So, democratic regimes know that security is extremely important, but always at the service of freedom. Always. To protect freedom, to enforce freedom, not to diminish them. This is what Sir Julian King said, and I completely agree. Well, he said it much better, but I mean, I agree with him. There is no trade-off between security and freedom. That's why to keep in a balance both looks to me, well, a bit dangerous, and to look for efficacy, we have to be, of course, in favor of efficacy. But the most efficacious regimes are dictatorships. They are extremely in favor of efficacy, so that no one can speak, no one can think, because everything is clear and cut clear. So I would recommend very much to be on the line of knowing that security should always be at the service of freedom, not the other way around. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to ask the speakers to stick to the regulation, namely 2 minutes speaking time. Thus, we will have enough time to give the floor to our panelists to respond to the questions. And I see a long list of speakers, actually. Now I give the floor to Madam Chinini from the European Parliament.
Thank you, Chair. We're very grateful that you've included this panel in today's business. I'm in the Libe Committee and the Special Committee on Terrorism, and I've dealt with some of these issues. I'm very grateful to the commissioners for the dedication that they have demonstrated. I know they've worked very hard on these issues, and safe use of the internet is a very important area. That said, the various structures which have been approved to make the internet a safer place will require a lot of resources. As Commissioner Gabriel very well knows, human resources are vital too. Commissioner King referred on several occasions to the need to work on countering illicit content online, from sexual exploitation of children to abuse, financial illicit activities, online propaganda, defense of terrorism, and so on. This is a very complex issue. The internet knows no borders, and it is also very difficult to take material down, because material goes online very, very quickly, goes viral very, very quickly. So, picking up on what earlier speakers have said, particularly Mr. Diaz de Mera, of course, who works very closely alongside me in the same committee, I do see a need to work not only on trying to counter the phenomenon, but also on trying to nip it in the bud in the first place, prevent it happening. And I think, as Mr. Wainwright was saying, Europol has a key role in terms of defining and countering different types of offence. And Europol also provides vital assistance to member states when member states are not in a position to create the structures that they need. For instance, the Internet Referral Unit in Europol has provided excellent backup to countries. But picking up on what you're saying, that there are ongoing changes. Criminals keep changing their ways of working and keep changing the way in which they use technology, becoming increasingly sophisticated in their use of technology. So what can be done in terms of prevention? Obviously, we need cooperation. That's already been mentioned. Everybody else has said that. And of course, I agree with it. But what else could we do? If prevention is the byword, and criminals always seem to be one step ahead of those who are trying to track them, then, as Mr. Diaz de Mera has said, is it enough to boost the role of Europol Cybercrime Centre and the IRU to counter the use of online instruments by organised crime, or should we be thinking of other ways of tackling them?
Благодаря.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Mr. Axel Voss.
Nein. Ich glaube mal, wenn wir noch
I think if we want to show the clear will not to give in to crime, I think we have to make a very serious effort. We have top-heavy structures, unwieldy structures. So when you're dealing with cross-border phenomena like this, we need to be more flexible, have more flexible working structures. The points that have been raised by Maria Gabriel and Julian King, to be prepared to try, give these things a try on a trial and error basis. But in any case, we have to be more flexible. We need to see what does work, what doesn't work, and that we can put an end to the things that don't work. And with our current very cumbersome, unwieldy structures, that's very difficult to do in a democracy. The focus now on cyber crime and the darknet as well, this represents a major challenge which we're facing, and we can't leave Europol on its own with this challenge. Now, it's all well and good to say that we have Europol and we don't need to worry about these things. If we want to take it really seriously, to seriously do something against cybercrime, we have to back up Europol and the member states and ensure they have the means and resources that they need. We need about, 10 times what we're prepared to spend now. We have to be prepared to put our money where our mouths are. Now, as regards the biggest challenges we face, well, the Internet of Things, and here we're talking about different bodies of legislation. We have different approaches in human terms and different types of structure of software and IT structures. So what we need is a strategy to prevent cyber attacks. We need a strategy to make our IT structures stronger and more resilient. We need a way to find a way too of responding to these threats. So it's not just a question of sitting back and preparing to defend ourselves, but we have to be prepared to and able to hit back when necessary. This raises a lot of issues, of course, it's true, but we can't just present ourselves as innocent victims waiting for an attack. We have to be proactive. We need more robust systems. We need security by design with quality control. We need reporting requirements. We need practice runs, exercises, so that we can improve our reaction capabilities. And of course, we need to be able to do this within Europe and across the Atlantic. We need to work with other countries, with civil societies, with companies. And again, if we mean this seriously and we want to do it properly, then in my view, perhaps I'm a layman, well, I am a layman in this field, but I think we need to be talking about a tenfold increase in the resources now available. Thank you.
Благодаря. Още
Thank you. I'd like to ask once again everyone who is requesting the floor for questions to keep to the 2 minutes because there's more and more requests for the floor.
давам думата.
I give the floor now to Maria Grappini.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte. Încerc să mă încadrez în 2 minute. Pornesc.
Thank you. As has been said, the world is ever more interconnected, and as Mrs. Gabriel has said, we need a stronger, safer internet, one which can also protect our citizens. We have a very good format here in this meeting with the national parliaments and 2 key commissioners who've made a big input, and Europol to boot. I have 2 questions for both commissioners. From Commissioner Gabriel, you said that you have concerns because the procedures for major platforms can't really be applied to smaller platforms, and that we have to be particularly careful when it comes to SMEs. How can we protect them? Do you have a particular plan in that respect as to how one can best protect them, the SMEs? And then you mentioned the trusted flaggers. Here too, we have the national parliaments, which have their role to play. How can we choose them, and how can we trust them? Commissioner King, you said in your intervention that we have to prepare countermeasures for such attacks so that they don't happen in the first place. Do you have already some specific proposals? And perhaps in terms of obtaining information, the representatives of national parliaments are already present, and it would be interesting to go back with this information.
Давам думата.
Now I give the floor to Mr. Papatheodorou.
Pardon. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Nous tenons à...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We would like to congratulate the 3 speakers for the very interesting presentations, which give a wide overview of cybercrime issues. One sometimes has the impression that the ways in which technology is developing and being used by this type of criminal compared to the technology available to the member states to combat cybercrime, that there's a time lag between the 2. My comment concerns the nature of cybercrime. This is something which is not purely criminal in nature, but also has the support at times of the relevant services of certain third countries. So when it comes to the possible manipulation, meddling with democratic societies and democratic systems, what will Europol's main concerns and main focus be with respect to these issues, and what sort of strategy, common strategy, could one envisage for the European Union? Thank you.
Благодаря ви.
Thank you. Now Ms. Stevens from the European Parliament has the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner King and Mr. Wainwright have just given examples of cybercrimes. Money laundering constitutes an important source to finance organized crime. What measures does the Commission and Europol envisage for the future in order to better counteract the growing phenomenon of money laundering via the unregulated digital cash and cryptocurrencies? Thank you.
Благодаря за това кратко.
Thank you for this very concise contribution. Now Ms. Kermanli from France has the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the various speakers who have shed light on these important issues. I think that it raises 3 questions. perhaps with one of the key players who can really help tackle these issues. The Commissioner mentioned earlier that European agencies have to follow up offences or infringements, but what about where the member states are responsible for the criminal procedures with the major disparities between member states? Now, the Europol representative pointed out that in the various activities we have to set up a task force, we have to involve the private sector, the banking sector, and others. And when you look at this more closely, one sees that and businesses do come under attack and don't actually openly recognize these or publicize these because they're concerned about their reputation. If we look at the final aspect, the transactions in the dark net, we don't know whether Europol closely supervises the dark net, but we know that some member states encourage the dark net for various reasons. So my last question would be, how can one best act and how can one be effective if the member states and parliaments don't play their full role in this effort? It's a political question. How can one change the approach by certain member states? I noted what our Belgian colleague said earlier. 85% of contributions come from just 5 member states, 15% of the inputs at Europol is the other 23 countries. So there's a political responsibility weighing on member states. What can we do as members of parliament with respect to our governments?
Thank you. Ms. Wedel from the Netherlands has the floor now.
Thank you. I thank Mr. Wainwright for the insight. Mr. Wainwright informed us that Europol can see trends. Can Mr. Wainwright inform us about the trends Europol sees and where the threats are coming from? And what does Europol do to combat these threats? Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Tiefning.
Der Delegation aus Österreich.
As regards the Austrian delegation, we would like to thank you for this very interesting and informative event and the very interesting contributions we've heard. My question concerns artificial intelligence. How can Europol deal with this issue of the threat to artificial intelligence, and also what could be the threats from terrorists to artificial intelligence in terms of doing damage in the internet, in internet structures? And we see that artificial intelligence is developing all the time. We need to ask what we need to do at a political level to face these challenges, to make sure that we have the necessary resources available to protect our citizens in the future. Thank you.
Thank you to the Austrian speaker. You really complied with the time limit. And the last speaker, Lord Solly from the UK.
Thank you. I just want to say there was a reference made by speakers to both fake news and to government intervention. Government intervention in Estonia, for example, was clearly and profoundly wrong. It gets more complex when you're talking about fake news and intervention in elections. And I just really want to ask, have there any ideas about what we can do about that, apart from being very vigilant and drawing attention to it when it happens, because I find it quite difficult to think how we can legislate to stop it.
Thank you. And before I give the floor to the commissioners and to the director of Europol, I'd like to thank you for your active questions. This reflects the new challenges to cyber security. I believe we have done everything possible with Claude Moraes to choose the most pertinent topics for the discussion. Commissioner King, you have the floor first.
Thank you very much. I like this order of replying to the questions because it allows me to reply to some and leaves the pleasure of replying to others to my colleagues. Thank you very much for your questions. Thanks for your engagement with this subject. I think we're all agreed that this is a really crucial subject that we need to keep on our agenda for meetings like this. You raise a number of very good questions. We haven't got complete answers to all of these questions because this is an evolving and developing area of challenge. But we want to work with you to try and do everything we can to make ourselves more cyber secure against a range of different threats that we've been talking about. So one or two of you asked about the strategy. There is a strategy which we're developing with the Member States and indeed with the European Parliament. And that is to reinforce the resilience of our systems, our platforms and our devices, to reinforce the deterrence against criminals, but also against non-state and state actors, to deter them from attacking us, and to boost the international cooperation. Those are the pillars of our strategy. As we've sketched out, and we can go into more detail, if not in this session, then separately, we have concrete proposals for building resilience around a cybersecurity agency, which will help reinforce critical infrastructure and organize response to attacks, around a series of proposals to raise standards through, to start with, a voluntary process of certification. This is something the Commission has done in other areas very successfully. We believe that we can do it in this area too. And to significantly boost research into cybersecurity. All of those are part of building our resilience. But it's not just physical resilience, it's also the resilience of our societies and our citizens and increasing cybersecurity awareness, because it's a responsibility of everybody, right down to the individual. So we also have a program of awareness building, education, skills building, to try and do something about the human dimension of cybersecurity as well. It is crucial that we work with the private sector. 90-something%, 95% at least of what we're talking about is in the private sector. So we have incentives, both negative and positive, to encourage the private sector to work with us on these issues. Rob Wainwright mentioned the impact of the GDPR and the NIS directive, but also, I would say, the positive impact of the network of public-private partnerships that we're building up on cybersecurity research and development will further reinforce the already good public-private cooperation. And we work with third countries and partners on this, because it is absolutely essential, not only that like-minded countries find ways of reinforcing their cooperation, but that we are willing, in the right circumstances, to engage with countries who do not necessarily share exactly the same approach to these issues. Because there may be things that we can do with some governments to help tackle what, again, Rob Wainwright talked about, the mingling of state and criminal activities. We certainly shouldn't let that challenge go without trying to engage with it. We also have plans to reinforce how the member states work together on information sharing and increasing our knowledge base, not only for dealing with cyber threats, but with a whole range of other threats, which goes to the question from Mr. Diaz de Mera about building up our information systems. We have, as he says, a very ambitious program of reinforcing existing information systems, building new information systems, and making them work together. That is a program that stretches from now into the beginning of the next decade. I'd like us to be able to go faster, but we can only go as fast as the legislative agreement and the legislative framework. So there we're in the hands of the European Parliament and the national parliaments, and the development of the practical and technological foundations of these, and infrastructure of these databases. So at the moment, providing we get the agreement on the outstanding questions, including interoperability, this year, which I sincerely hope we will, our program stretches until 2023. And we have set out a funding profile for that program as well. We have the funds in this financial framework. Of course, the future budget still has to be agreed, which brings me to a general point on resources. A number of you mentioned resources from different directions. We need to make sure that the efforts that we are talking about here on cybersecurity and information exchange are adequately resourced. That means supporting Europol. It means supporting a range of other agencies, EU LISA, the agencies on cyber as well, starting with the new reinforced ENISA, the cybersecurity agency. It means being willing to adequately fund research, and it means being willing to invest in skills and human development in this area. All of that comes at a price. We believe we have the resources for the next couple of years. But beyond that, we're talking about the future budget period. And there, we rely upon you. We rely upon the member states, including, crucially, the debate in national parliaments and the debate in the European Parliament, to determine the relative priority that you want to attach to these issues in the future budget. So I think it's very important that you're focused on this, that you're focused on it now, because there will be decisions to be taken in the coming months that will affect our ability to deliver effective security for years to come.
Thank you. Now, Commissioner Maria Gabriel will probably make Rob Wainwright's task easier. Thank you. I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for the commitment and for the numerous questions. I will focus on some of them. To start with, what we heard about cybercrime and crimes against children, this is probably the worst form of crime. We have to coordinate our efforts even better, and let me mention InHope and the Alliance for Protection of Minors. They give excellent results now, and today the different groups use quite different procedures for flagging illegal content, and thus we come back to the same issue once again: more coordination, more concerted efforts which bring together all different agencies. Now, what to do in order to improve our operational capacity and improve the cooperation with EC3?
Question. Tout d'abord, concernant la coopération.
On this issue in the field of cybersecurity between EC3 and ENISA, this cooperation does exist on technical issues, but then we have a second example, which is cooperation with CERT EU on an informal basis. It's true on specific cases. An example, when we had the attack for summer 2017, the head of EC3 and with NSC, with CERT EU, and we in the Commission, we had a direct contact. We were able to exchange information on a regular basis. Third point, we are currently working on a memorandum of understanding between EC3 and NCA and the EU Defence Agency to put this cooperation on operation cooperation on a formal basis, and we hope that it will be possible to conclude this memorandum of understanding. In Article 3 of the memorandum, it specifically states that there are a number of fields in which we can cooperate, from information exchange right up to education and training, and indeed cyber exercises. That's why I'm drawing your attention to the cyber exercises, because in our EU Commission proposal. This is an exercise is to be organized every 2 years with the member state. From now on, it will be once a year, and I think that would be very helpful this year in June to see what member states' vulnerabilities are, but also to foresee closer cooperation with Europol and EC3.
Думи за криптовалутите. Истината е, че
Now a few words about cryptocurrencies. Fact of the matter is that we're lagging behind on that, and the European Commission is taking steps in order to accelerate the measures and bring to the fore the expertise we have. First of all, on the 1st of February 2018, we announced setting up a European Observatory on blockchain. At the moment, we are now recruiting experts, and the members of the national delegations are called upon to pay special attention on that. The observatory would be able to focus specifically on cybersecurity. Along the same lines, everything that has to do with cybersecurity fits within fintech, as we call it, our legislative proposal. Allow me to mention also HashPC. This is something that we do not think of most of the time. We call it a supercomputer. And let me say the following. In 2012, Europe used to have 4 of the top 10. Now we are not in the top 10 anymore. So this is something for the member states to consider. They need to all that in order to very quickly establish doubtful behavior online. At the moment, we get €1 billion, 400,000 from the European Commission. The rest comes from the member states. And I would like to call upon you to consider that, because only 13 member states are on board. But this is something which would be very helpful to the national security of any one of the member states. So starting from encryption to establishing dubious behavior online. Now, allow me to mention the small platforms, and thank you for asking this question. What can be done about that? Them, of course, cooperation with the large ones, and perhaps we could think of a common database, as Europol is doing this for over 20,000 hashtags. Perhaps it is time to do something similar to counteract illegal content outside terrorism. Trusted flaggers, yes, the status is not forever. I organized a round table on this topic, and it was clearly stated that this status has to be updated all the time, so that these individuals would not be considered experts forever. They are volunteers. Let me make this clear. It is important to cooperate with that, because the numbers are really flabbergasting. 96% of the content which is flagged as illegal, 24 hours later is again uploaded on either larger or smaller platforms. That's why it is so important to cooperate with these people. Artificial intelligence, thank you, Austria, for focusing on it. We need to be coherent in what the EU wants to do in this respect. On the 25th of April, the European Commission will come up with an announcement concerning artificial intelligence. We are again recruiting experts at the moment. Our proposal would be to come up with a European alliance focusing on 3 key topics in artificial intelligence. First of all, improve technological capacity, and cybersecurity is covered by that. The second topic would be perhaps titled as too European, but after all, it is typical for the European approach. In other words, we try not to forget about very serious ethical issues, responsibility, rights, which we have discussed in the European Parliament at length, the rights of robots, for instance. And the third area is the impact of artificial intelligence on the labor market and skills. because today nobody can say for sure what jobs will disappear. According to analysis, between 9 and 60% of the jobs may disappear. In any event, this revolution would have an impact on employment, and artificial intelligence should serve man. So we have only one goal: to use the approach human and command. And finally, we want more entities, more operational capacity. We want more funding. Thank you all who mentioned that. I can't help but succumb to temptation here and say that in the next weeks and months we are going to hold very difficult debates on the multi-annual financial framework. One thing is quite clear: today we need to invest more in digitalization, and of course cybercrime is a topic within digitalization. We request more investment in cybersecurity in order to guarantee the security of our citizens. Just an example, the public-private partnership in cybercrime in Europe amounts to 1.8 billion. In the US, the investment is tenfold higher, so we can't expect the same results given this investment, this discrepancy. And in the next months, I hope that we will fight for the place of cybersecurity in the European budget. Thank you. And now Rob Wainwright will answer all the remaining questions which still have not got their answers.
Well, thank you for leaving me all the remaining questions. Actually, I have a few reflections. Mr. Diaz-de-Mera asked about what we can do about cryptocurrencies, and Commissioner Gabriel already mentioned some very good points. I mentioned in my address that it was a primary factor in the rise of ransomware. We're also seeing, of course, how it acts as a vehicle for modern-day investment frauds of the Ponzi-type schemes, and this is a major component as well. But as Ms. Stevens also said, it is a money laundering instrument, and that's the third security concern we have relating to cryptocurrencies, especially as criminals are moving more and more away from Bitcoin towards even more secure and virtually 100% anonymized other cryptocurrencies like Ethereum or Dash. So it's getting harder for us, therefore, to monitor transactions in this area. And there is a big hole in our anti-money laundering regime at the moment because these cryptocurrencies don't have a central banking authority like fiat currency. They're also not part of the current anti-money laundering regime. So there's no means by which financial institutions can report suspicious financial transactions, for example. Now that is changing. It should change with some of the measures that the Commissioner referred to, and also the fifth anti-money laundering directive. I think this is essential. I agree with the view of Mr. Terry Cabras about we shouldn't wish for the privatization of our policing. I agree. I think that's a good point he makes. He's not in the room, but I can still agree with him, I think. However, any move, I think, towards making the removal process at the subject of a judicial system after, as he put it, an appropriate law enforcement investigation, I wonder about the practicalities of that, given, as Commissioner King says, our aim is to have a 1-hour window for the identification and removal of that terrorist content. And indeed to do it on a very high scale, tens of thousands indeed that we're talking about over many months. So we have to think about the practicalities of that. I agree with people's views about resources, but I won't repeat what we've heard from the Commissioner. Regarding what Mr. Tivnik said about the threat of artificial intelligence, I think what we're seeing on the threat landscape is the likelihood of criminals developing a next generation of malware capability along artificial intelligence. So we will have, I think, self-learning malware capability that are introduced into the cybersecurity defenses of some private enterprises or even governments. As I said, will self-learn as it reads the system from within. and that clearly is a concern. We should also be concerned about the cybersecurity dimensions of quantum computing and how they, in some scenarios, could overcome any password protection. And so the days of having a password-centric security enterprise may be soon over. That said, in both respects, artificial intelligence and quantum computing, there are many opportunities as well, of course, for the way in which we investigate crime. And so, as always, it will be a bit of an arms race between the law enforcement, government community and the criminals as well. And finally, just to touch on the specific question from Mrs. Vessel about where the threats are coming from, I think it's from this more professionalized cybercriminal architecture that I described earlier. In terms of geographies, I think it's a global phenomena. There are major cybercriminal threats coming from India, from China, from Brazil, but especially from the Russian-speaking world. But it's difficult to actually isolate any particular region. This truly is a global phenomena, supported by this rather unregulated nature of the dark net in particular. I hope that between the three of us, Mr. Chairman, we have answered all of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will give the floor to my co-chair, Mr. Claude Moraes, to continue chairing until the end.
And that was a really interesting last session. Thank you to both commissioners and to Rob, and of course to the members. Excellent questions. So colleagues, this is the final session. I read a management book once which said, never begin a meeting or any session of a meeting at 4 o'clock on a Monday. They didn't actually say Monday, but they just said don't begin at 4 o'clock. They actually did say that. It's the time when you are sleepiest and most tired. So if you're feeling tired, it's not your fault. It's my management book's fault. And it's true. But this final session could not be more appropriate as a final session. Why? Because when the Europol regulation entered into force in May 2017, and the rapporteur is here, it identified two areas to strengthen Europol: the European Counterterrorism Centre, the ECTC, and the Internet Referral Unit. And we now see Europol as the core tasks of fighting terrorism and the prevention of organised crime. That's how our citizens see it. That's how the members of the European Parliament see it. So this final session is going to be concentrating on these core tasks of Europol and a kind of analysis. And to, of course, add to that, during this period, we, of course, then also had the appointment of a new security commissioner. So in this final session, it's appropriate that both of those colleagues speak to this final element, which is the fight against terrorism and the prevention of organised crime. So we're going to have both Commissioner King and Executive Director Wainwright speaking to us now for this final session, colleagues. So first, Commissioner King.
Thank you very much, Chair. And again, it's absolutely right that this subject is on the agenda because we are talking about core Europol business, dealing with some of the very important pressing transnational threats that we collectively have to deal with. As we said a little bit earlier in the press conference, member states and member states' authorities are and remain in the front line in trying to deal with these threats, whether it's serious and organised crime, cyber, or terrorism. But there is more that we can and indeed should be doing collectively at a European level to help and support those member states authorities in doing their job and helping to keep European citizens safe. We try and do that through a range of different activities, but one crucial element of that help and support is through our agencies, the network of our agencies. And Europol is an absolutely central agency in this fight against these threats. It has gone from strength to strength under the current leadership, and we are confident that it will continue to go from strength to strength under the new leadership. Part of reinforcing our collective effort against these threats is to show that what we're doing works, so that we have a virtuous circle of support from the member states, engagement with the agencies, that they do want to share information, that they do want to work together on practical cooperation because it works. And I have to say that Europol and the work that Europol have done is, again, central to showing that we can make a practical difference, not just a theoretical difference, but a practical difference to help and support to member states. As an agency, Europol may not have the power directly to make arrests or directly to launch criminal investigations, but it is absolutely vital in providing efficient and operational support to and between member states in the fight against terrorism and organised crime. And that was reaffirmed when last year we, from the Commission, carried out a comprehensive assessment of EU security policies. The role of agencies was praised, and in particular, the role of Europol was praised consistently by the member states. And I think that's incredibly encouraging. It doesn't mean everything is absolutely already 100% right. Doesn't mean that Europol has absolutely all the resources it needs. We still need to work to reinforce what we're doing in these areas, but it's very encouraging to know that we have such engagement from the member states. On terrorism, as we've already touched upon, the terrorist threat level across Europe remains very, very high. In a number of countries, not least the countries that have actually experienced attacks over the last couple of years, the threat level remains, if not at the highest level, then one level down. We have made progress on the ground against Daesh in Iraq and in Syria, and that is helpful, but we shouldn't for one moment allow ourselves to think that that somehow diminishes the threat from Islamist extremist terrorism. It does not. That threat continues to exist. It evolves and changes, and we need to be ready to evolve our response. A key part of that response is to seek to close down the space in which terrorists operate by making it harder for them to get access to money, to firearms, to explosives, by strengthening the controls and the rules around that, by making it harder for people to move around in the high days of the caliphate, making it illegal to travel to and from Iraq and Syria for terrorist purposes, to significantly enhance our collective information picture, including about who's coming in and out of our shared space. So as we were just discussing, we have sought to get the best out of existing information systems, to develop, where we agree, some new information systems like the entry-exit system and the planned European travel and authorization system, to plug some information gaps, and to try and make all of those information systems interoperable, that is, make them work together effectively so that those on the front line, policemen, border guards and immigration officers, can get the information they need, accurate, timely information to which they have the authority to access so that they can do their jobs. Europol has a role as an EU information hub on these matters, and it plays that role very well, and we want to make sure that it can continue to play that role as part of this wider work to build our interoperability. We've also been working to better protect our public spaces, which have been subject of a series of attacks, horrible attacks over the last year. That means bringing together cities, local authorities, but also putting them together with experts. And again, Europol have been engaged in that work. We need to reinforce the work that we're doing to prevent attacks by tackling some of the root causes, notably by tackling radicalization, both online that we've been talking about and in our communities. And Europol have had a key role on both dimensions through the Internet Referral Unit helping us to tackle online radicalization with the platforms, but also through sharing their expertise and experience with a variety of people who work in the community. That work to support Europol is going to continue, and the work that we're going to do to try and reinforce our security union is going to continue. In April, we will bring forward, next month, we will bring forward a package of new measures on combating terrorism, which will include measures on explosive precursors, firearms, terrorist financing, the security of ID cards, and better and faster access to electronic evidence. In all of this, we will want to continue the closest possible cooperation with our agencies and, in particular, Europol. The European Agenda of Security of a few years ago set up the European Counterterrorism Centre, as you said, Chair. And that centre has done invaluable work to help and support member states and to encourage them to work together and to share information. As Rob Wainwright said in the press conference, we are seeing greater member state engagement in that information sharing. There has been a significant increase, 30% increase, in the amount of information that is being shared across Europol's Siena mechanism. And there's also been a very significant increase in the number of requests from member states to Europol to help and support them in various investigations, in particular terrorism investigations. So all of that work has been very valuable. We want to continue to do everything we can to help and support the ECTC. The links between terrorism and organised crime should not be minimised. Serious and organised crime can help provide some of those means that I've just been talking about: firearms, explosives, money, fake documents, for terrorists to carry out their attacks. And Europol, indeed, in its reporting has underlined the links. The 2017 Serious and Organised Crime Threat Assessment particularly pointed to this. We, from the Commission side, remain committed to taking action also to help and support the Member States in fighting organised crime. Again, working very closely with and through Europol. Europol is at the centre of the policy cycle, which is the coordination of shared objectives and priorities amongst the Member States and the Member States authorities in tackling serious and organised crime. The current policy cycle runs from 2018 to 2021 and identified 10 priority areas. For each of those priority areas, there are operational action plans which, drawn up with Europol, need now to be followed up and implemented with the Member States. For example, in fact, the Commission suggested, Member States agreed, that the fight against illicit firearms trafficking should remain a key priority for the upcoming policy cycle. And I'm glad to say that Member States recognise, again, the help and assistance Europol has given them. The number of investigative cases against illicit firearms trafficking has gone up all across the EU. Europol regularly organises joint action days together with the Member States and other agencies, which have been very successful. In 2017, this kind of joint working led to very significant seizures of firearms and rounds of ammunition in various countries, as well as the arrest of around 1,000 criminal suspects and the initiation of around 600 investigations. So here is a concrete example of where working together, facilitated by Europol, can deliver results against serious and organised crime. Another key priority of the policy cycle is the fight against drug trafficking. The new EU Action Plan on Drugs, which runs until 2020, provides a strengthened response to the newly emerging health and security challenges in the area of illicit drug use and trafficking. And Europol, again, is at the centre of that work. Ensuring our citizens' safety means fighting crime as well as preventing it. Hence, the Commission welcomes the inclusion of crime prevention as a horizontal priority across the action plans in the current policy cycle. We have been funding studies, projects and networks aimed at developing and sharing best practices in crime prevention among the Member States and in fighting cross-border crime, and we will continue to do that. To conclude, we will continue to offer our full support to Europol and our other JH agencies in this work to keep our citizens safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. And let's go straight now to Rob Wainwright, please.
Oh, thank you. Well, I shouldn't perhaps repeat some of the discussion we had at earlier sessions, or indeed the words that Commissioner King just shared with us, but just to underline the point on terrorism, a complexity of a threat that we haven't seen before, drawn across a community of foreign terrorist fighters, but also many tens of thousands who are within our societies at home, the most enterprising use of technology, and this emergence, as Commissioner said, of a stronger crime terrorist network than we've seen before. I mean, that's important not least because it should tell us something about how we gear our response, that we cannot rely on rather traditional measures of fighting terrorism, which have overwhelmingly focused on the institutions and the intelligence community. We have to also embrace the broader capabilities of the police community, and for that I think Europol has a very special role to connect the two, and that's what we're currently focusing on. But in general terms, as the Commissioner said, a much better response in terms of international cooperation in Europe for information sharing. 3 times as many counter-terrorist cases last year than the year before at Europol, 439. It's a substantial number of counter-terrorist investigations that Europol was supporting in that year. For organised crime, drugs still being, in volume terms, the preeminent threat, as I said earlier today, trying to reinvigorate that by bringing better partnerships, recognising that most of the drugs that are consumed in large quantities in our societies in Europe are coming either from other parts of the world, of course, or are homegrown. We have a significant problem of synthetic drugs that are produced in Belgium, in Netherlands, in parts of the Baltic countries that are a real problem. And we're concerned, for example, about the terrible epidemic relating to methamphetamine in the United States and how that might come across to Europe. For people smuggling, something which was or has been the fastest growing criminal sector in Europe, certainly from 2015 onwards, when we saw the criminal community exploit a sudden opportunity as they saw it. The number of irregular arrivals in Europe in that year being 5 times as many as the year before, 1 million of them in total. It gave an on-the-spot new criminal opportunity, and we saw the ad hoc response to that. That's since settled down into a sizable criminal market worth at least 5 billion euros a year, dominated now, however, by not these individual criminals, but syndicates that are now running end-to-end operations to exploit these poor people who are making their way to Europe. And here we have made some considerable progress through the European Migrant Smuggling Centre established at Europol, identifying 70,000 suspects in this field operating in Europe currently, running large number of operations, but we have some blind spots as well, particularly in our intelligence sharing. I mentioned Turkey earlier, and also the MENA countries, and that has to be the focus of our work. For the trafficking of human beings, also a bigger problem than I think many member states recognize, or at least give priority to. And here a somewhat connection with people smuggling, at least in terms of how unaccompanied minors in their many thousands have been part of this migrant population that have come to Europe since then, unaccompanied and therefore vulnerable once they are perhaps in reception centres to being picked up by criminals who will exploit them, maybe for illegal labour exploitation or even worse for sexual exploitation. So that's a concern. Also the trend, which is worth noting, I think, that of all the victims of human trafficking in Europe today, 2/3 of them are from the European Union. So this is not a problem so much anymore of victims coming here from Africa or Asia, but within our own communities, being moved from one part of the EU to another. There are very many other high priorities in terms of organized crime that get perhaps less attention than they deserve. The fake and counterfeit market, particularly as it's helped again in the technology space, is enormous. And by some estimates, the damage to the economy, to the brands of our businesses in Europe in terms of what we call intellectual property crime is estimated at around 85 billion euros each year. So it's an enormous enterprise. And for that reason also a relatively small dedicated centre has been established at Europol to help combat this. New in the policy cycle this year means we are taking a greater interest also now in environmental crime, especially in terms of wildlife and illicit waste trafficking, and also trying to bring a focus in other areas. I mentioned earlier also high priority investigations that Europol are always ready to support in, as we are currently doing in Malta and Slovakia. And in real terms, we are aided by the significant increases in our information sharing that I referred to earlier, and also by the way in which we can convert that information and data analytical capability into real operations on the ground. And what is most important here, I think, is the work perhaps of our liaison officer community, which are embedded in our headquarters. These provide the necessary operational link. They represent the authorities that do have the coercive powers that Europol doesn't. And it is them on the spot that collaborate with each other, that are sitting in the operational rooms each day and coordinating arrest operations, for example, across multiple jurisdictions. So it really is a very successful integrated team effort of Europol analysts, technical specialists, and law enforcement officers from that community. The largest centre in the world, 220 liaison officers from over 40 countries at Europol today, and a beating heart of our operational success, I would say. My last point is to repeat a point that I've made in other fora, which is how we also try to convert our information into understanding the strategic dynamics of crime so that we can undermine that infrastructure and have a long-term effect. And in terms of money laundering, here we still have a lot of work to do. We always talk about following the money. We always know that to hurt the criminal the most, we must take his assets away. Well, we're doing a very poor job of doing that, frankly, despite the fact that we have put in place such a well-developed regulatory regime over the last 30 years, despite the fact that we have significant legislation. The facts that we see at Europol, based on, I think, our very accurate understanding, is that we are collectively seizing 1% only of criminal assets each year. So the regime is not working well enough, and I think if we were to make any major difference to that, we would have a very telling effect on the ability of criminals to operate in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rob. And this is the final session, colleagues, I just want to mention that following this session, the co-chairs will just make a few announcements just to confirm some of the points of this morning, so that this is all confirmed. So please do stay for this. And also we have, again, a reasonably long list. Is it just 6 or will there be more? Okay, we only have 5. So if you speak for a couple of minutes and then, I know because one or two colleagues may be going now, so we'll have the 5 and then we'll make some concluding remarks about this morning's rules. So let's go straight away and up to 2 minutes, please, colleagues. So Mr. Jacques Bigot, please, from France.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. I'd like to thank you for organising such an enlightening day. I think it has demonstrated its worth. You talked about adding information to the database and that 85% of information was coming from a very limited number of member states. Given that we are members of Parliament nationally, could we perhaps contact our national governments and authorities and raise the issue of communication or lack of communication with Europol? Could it also perhaps be helpful for Europol to provide information to the designated representatives in the different national parliaments? It may not be through official channels, but some kind of communication may be helpful, and we could then contact the authorities. That is part of our job, and it could make life work easier for Europol. For Commissioner King, given what you've said, then would it not be logical to go beyond police cooperation and have a European strategy for combating terrorism and organised crime, starting by improving relations between public prosecutors? By 2020, some states would have funding for public prosecutors internationally, but better coordination to combat organised crime could be useful, because our citizens are, of course, afraid of terrorism and organised crime, and there's a danger that they will turn their backs on the EU and lose faith in it.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Kevin O'Callaghan. Sorry if I've pronounced that wrongly, which is embarrassing given I'm British and I should know, but is it Kevin O'Callaghan, please?
I won't even Claude, but thank you very much. On behalf of the Irish Parliamentary delegation, I would like, first of all, to record our congratulations to both you and your joint chair, and indeed all concerned, on reaching agreement this morning on the rules of procedure for the conduct of business for the JPSG. Now, the critical focus of Europol on drug trafficking noted and fully encouraged and supported, and along with all of the other areas of address already mentioned by Mr. Wainwright, would he please advise if Europol is paying serious attention to the criminal activities of illegal tobacco marketeers and producers, and any role that legitimate or licensed producers may have in this illicit trade, a trade that impacts seriously on the economies of European Union member states, and not least as a result of the serious health consequences of sustained tobacco use. The illegal tobacco trade undermines the efforts of state governments to discourage tobacco users of their habit and to dissuade our young taking up this health-threatening practice. Your affirmative response would be appreciated. Goramahagat.
Thank you very much, and once again apologies for my mispronunciation. Next is Caterina Cinici from the European Parliament, please.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. I'd like to thank Commissioner King and Mr. Wainwright once again for their presentations. Personally speaking, I fully agree with Commissioner King's comments regarding the need to boost cooperation in order to combat organised crime and terrorism, and more specifically the connection between organised crime and terrorism, because money is laundered into terrorism very often, and the illicit financing of terrorism often comes from organised crime, people smuggling, drug smuggling, and so on. So I can see the importance of this. What kind of instruments could be used to improve that cooperation, given that we think that such cooperation is essential? Mr. Wainwright said that only 1% of the proceeds of crime is actually confiscated. What can we do about that? Is more cooperation enough to do the trick in terms of combating these forms of crime? Or should we be more creative? And if so, what kind of new instrument might work? A European Public Prosecutor's Office, for instance. According to the current ways of working, would it be useful? Could it work in a different way in future? Could it do research into terrorism and organised crime, perhaps? Are there any new ideas there?
Thank you. Ms. Caramanli, please, from France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. 2 questions. Firstly, in relation to cooperation between Europol and other EU agencies. Do you have close cooperation with any agencies, for a start? If so, which? And how do you organise cooperation with Frontex? Several issues were referred to a few moments ago, but I'm slightly concerned there may be some overlap. Isn't there a danger of overlap between Frontex and Europol responsibilities? Because Frontex says it's combating terrorism and firearms trafficking too. What about closer links with diplomats, EU diplomats? Couldn't they be very helpful in terms of giving you information that would help you protect the security of the EU? Also, different forms of cooperation. You referred to this a moment ago. Police cooperation between member states is very important. The added value of Europol thus far has tended to be about the professional quality of seconded experts from member states. That pooling of expertise allows for interpersonal contact between different police forces in the EU. So that's been the added value so far. Digitalizing the exchange of information, data from databases and so on a standardized basis can lead to more data being exchanged. But if you have a standardized format, is there not a danger that you lose the quality of data because you're having to squeeze it all into the same sized box? Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Jose Alberto Martin Toledano from Spain.
Sí, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. So, Europol is combating terrorism and organised crime. That's its core task. That's why Europol was created. So, picking up on what Mr. Diaz de Mera was saying, in order to achieve that, it needs a bigger budget. We'd support that in Spain. The experience that we've had with our national police and our Guardia Civil in Spain in terms of combating terrorism is that this is one area where it would be helpful to learn the lessons from previous experience and cooperate with other police forces, because unfortunately we have had limited experience, and so Europol can be a very useful partner for pooling experience and working together. Picking up on this afternoon's discussions, I've got a couple of questions. 1. How can radicalization, Islamic radicalization, be better combated, particularly with returning ISIS combatants who are a danger to our societies in terms of the terrorism threat. How do terrorist organizations interconnect between themselves and with organized crime groups such as money laundering, firearms trafficking, people trafficking networks? There are connections very often between the terrorism and organized crime groups, and we'd be interested to hear more about that.
Felipe from.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Allow me to ask a brief question on the prevention of organized crime. I understand the worry with terrorism and the need to fight and to prevent terrorist attacks. But I think that emphasizing terrorism, you should not forget other tasks that we have to face before the threats for democratic societies that we are also facing and that are also real. I'm thinking in money laundering and other forms of transnational economic crime. We know that the organized crime uses the legal financial system, legal financial institutions, and the tax havens to money laundering, to finance corruption, and to erode democracy in general. And the question is, what's your opinion about the level of cooperation between national authorities and financial institutions in order to prevent the economic crime? And finally, what do you think, do you think that the legal framework of the state members of the European Union is appropriate, or if we need some improvements on that subject? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Mr. Metz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I think that the creation of the ECTC was of utmost importance, and of course it still is. A very good initiative, and I've learned today that the engagement of the member states to share intel and information is increasing, is improving. So actually we should seize this moment to maybe even be more ambitious. As Commissioner King said, we still need to reinforce also our working methods. After 9/11, the NCTC was created, and they shared or combined or merged information of 17 different agencies. But what's even more important, the intel, actually the outcome of the information, was also transmitted to local police officers and so on. My two questions: one, do we actively cooperate with the NCTC? And two, do we have the same ambition, which means do we also want to provide all the necessary intel and information also to our police officers in the street so we can prevent, for instance, terrorist attacks? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Mr. Popov from Bulgaria.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Wainwright, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be brief. After the terrorist organizations suffer a military loss in Syria and Iraq, you said it yourselves, the terrorists would be using new tools. And one of these tools are cyber attacks. And they may attack power stations and the power distribution network. In the US, they conducted such an experiment, and the experts managed to break into the cybersecurity of such critical infrastructure. This resulted into improving the infrastructure. However, would steps be taken for a common European protection, a protocol for protecting such critically important infrastructure from cyber attacks? And here we are not only talking of member states, but also neighboring countries, the Western Balkans, a case in point, because such an attack in a third country, but a neighboring country to the EU, will result into very serious consequences for the entire EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, you may have noticed that Commissioner King had to leave. This was an error over flight times, and he asked me to apologise profusely on his behalf. This was not intended, and he also indicated earlier that he would answer any questions in writing if necessary, and he does apologise. So our apologies for this, and Rob was kindly will answer, I think, the questions that were specifically put to him. Rob, if you could do this, please.
Firstly, can I thank Mr. Bigot for an excellent idea, which is that we could use more the delegates of national parliaments to reach the national authorities, because yes, it is a constant challenge of Europol to reach all of the authorities, to make sure they understand the value that we can bring and the requirements that we have. And also he suggested that maybe we should provide even specific advices per country to each parliament. I think, Mr. Chairman, also what we have here is, at the JPSG now, is a network of parliamentary contacts in each member state that Europol can use in that way. So I will be following up, our teams will be following up with maybe utilising this network with requests for you to help us at the national level. I thank him again for that idea. For Mr. O'Kalin, I can indeed positively affirm that we are investigating those criminal groups that are involved in illegal tobacco smuggling and indeed any other major issues that are supporting that trade, including from within the sector. It's part of what we call excise fraud. It has long since been a major part of our work. I did not mention it earlier simply because I was seeking to summarize the work that we are doing, but that is part of our work. Now, Ms. Chinichi and Mr. Felipe both asked about the anti-money laundering regime and how it could be improved. Mr. Felipe asked especially about whether or not the work of the financial institutions are reliable enough. Well, the regulations are such that they are under a threat of being fined if they do not carry out the necessary procedures, and therefore, as we know, many of the banks have been fined many billions of dollars in the past. So that has forced the banks to invest heavily in running their compliance regimes. There are tens of thousands of compliance officers that are now employed by the major banks in Europe that are running these regimes at a cost, we think, globally of something approaching $20 billion. So it's an enormous regime. It's just not very effective. And that's because the design of it is out of date. It's based on the idea of high volume transaction monitoring. Every single financial transaction going through a bank must be checked. And the banks run algorithms to monitor all of these, and these produce so-called alerts. And of these alerts, they all have to be checked by these compliance officers, and some of them finally reach the threshold of what's known as a suspicious activity report, which goes to the law enforcement teams. Now, let me tell you, only 5% of all those alerts checked by the banking compliance officers reach the grade of even being reported to the police, only 5%. So 95% of the time, they're looking at noise. And even then, of all the alerts that are then reported to law enforcement, only 10% of those are investigated further. Partly because the financial intelligence units don't have the resources, partly because also the quality, frankly, of the intelligence produced is very low. And that's why we get only a 1% return rate finally. It's an enormous effort to produce very little. And instead, we should be much more clever in the way in which we use the intelligence of institutions like Europol to start at the top and not at the bottom. Because we know at Europol who are the many hundreds of principal money launderers in Europe. And I want to use those names and share them with the banking authorities and ask them to check the financial transactions relating to these people, not everyday citizens who are just moving money between different savings accounts. And we are prevented from doing that because the nature of the regulations in protecting data privacy and banking secrecy means that we cannot do it. And there are particular restrictions on intelligence sharing across borders. So a simple solution would be to create, alongside the network of national FIUs, a European FIU based at Europol. Not instead of the national ones, but in addition. So that immediately provides the legal gateway to share this data and do something which of course we should be doing, which is to monitor the flows of illegal money across borders. This was brought forward by the European Parliament as part of the latest anti-money laundering directive proposal and has been rejected by Council. So you ask what is a simple thing to do. We gave a very idea of what a simple thing was to do, and it was supported by the European Parliament, but unfortunately not supported by other EU institutions. We find it very frustrating at Europol that these things happen, and that we remain, therefore, in the territory of only being 1% successful at fighting financial crime. Ms. Karamanli asked me about cooperation with Frontex. We have to be careful about a possible overlap. I agree. But there are very major differences in the respective mandates, of course, and especially in regard to capabilities to collect and process personal data, which is the core task of Europol. It is not the core task of Frontex. And insofar as they can process it through their work, they have to pass it on to either a national authority or Europol within a maximum of 3 months. And they do not have core analysis systems like we do. And I think, therefore, that makes sure that we can work more in harmony rather than duplicating the efforts. Mr. Metsu asked about the lessons of 9/11. I think we're still learning that. And, of course, we do not operate within a federal system in Europe like the United States. So it is more difficult to develop a similar system. But we are following it, and we are on the road, I think, to implementing a more cohesive response. And in the meantime, absolutely cooperating with the United States authorities very much indeed. If I didn't answer some of the other questions, maybe it was more for Commissioner King, Mr. Moraes, but that's enough from me, I think.
Thank you very much, Rob. And I've noted the questions and comments addressed to Commissioner King. I'll be seeing him next week, so I will convey these to him directly. And you may get a response from him. So thank you very much, Rob. So colleagues, now we come to the final session. We just want to, both of us, make some conclusions. If you could just be patient for one moment longer and we can do this. Mrs. Svitanov is just going to begin. This will be very brief, but please remain for this. Mrs. Svitanov, please.
Dear colleagues, we are about to finish today's work within the time scheduled in the agenda. I would like to thank you all for the constructive dialogue, for being so brief and concise. The last item on today's agenda is to convey thanks to all participants in today's meeting of the JSPC. I would like to convey specific thanks to the parliaments of those countries that we contacted recently: Germany, France, Romania, Slovakia, Switzerland, Denmark. I would like to thank our Danish colleagues for their understanding yesterday. We had a conversation and we came to an agreement which will be announced, namely that the working group that will function until the end of 2019 will be looking for further ways to make the work more efficient. I would like to thank all the 207 participants in today's forum. Without each and every one of you, this session would not have been successful, including for the planning between 2017 to 2021. Fighting terrorism, prevention of terrorism, fighting cybercrime, and so on and so forth. All of these areas are very important. In one of the panels, Rob Wainwright announced that after Brexit, we will lose a substantial and important supplier of information which would have guaranteed improvement of the security in the EU. I would like to congratulate also all national parliaments. Due to their active involvement, we will be able to maintain the high standard of security, and we all will be able to use the available information and share it with Great Britain. I believe this will be one of our new challenges, and I'm sure we all rely on the exchange of information with Europol. I would like to assure you on behalf of the Bulgarian delegation that being an active participant in the trio of presidency, we will fulfill all the commitments we have undertaken regarding the rules of procedure. We are closing today's meeting after the concluding remarks of Mr. Moraes, my co-chair. I would like to wish success to our Austrian colleagues who will preside the Council in the second half of this year. I would like to thank also all volunteers who organized today's meeting for your comfortable stay. And I would like to thank also the interpreters for today's debate. Their work made possible the participation of all of us and overcoming the language barriers. Now I give the floor to Mr. Claude Moraes. Thank you, Mr. De Mera, for your substantial contribution, for everything you've said. Thank you, Rob Wainwright, and I would like to thank also Madame Catherine Debo, who is the future Europol director. I'm sure that given your listening to today's debate, there will be no problems in the future, both in fulfilling the core activities of Europol and trying to increase the budget of the Europol within the multi-annual financial network. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Svetan. If you could hang on for a moment longer, we did agree just to summarise very quickly some of the things that we had agreed earlier on today. So for those delegations who had, of course, worked very hard to get to this agreement, if you could hang on for 1 second and I'll just summarise. Of course, first of all, to express my gratitude alongside Mr. Svetanov and Mr. Diaz de Mera for reaching an agreement on the JPSG rules of procedure. As mentioned during the debate, some points will need to be addressed by the presidential troika in the coming weeks. And if I can say just very briefly, first, the presidential troika will set up a working group with the Danish delegation in order to come up with recommendations by the review of the rules of procedure in October 2019. One man is left behind in the Danish delegation, so you've heard it. That's good. Secondly, the importance of linguistic diversity and the related funding needs for Europol to be able to provide documents in other languages will be mentioned in the co-chair's summary conclusions as well. Third, the presidential troika will need to develop guidelines for the procedure for questions to Europol, and it will also need to start a debate on which topics the JPSG could focus for establishing subgroups. Fourth, in more general terms, it is worthwhile to reiterate that the review of the rules of procedure in October 2019 is a general review. And finally, colleagues, we have heard interesting contributions on the Europol multi-annual programming document. I said earlier that delegations will receive a letter in the coming weeks inviting you to send detailed written contributions ahead of our next meeting, scheduled to take place in Brussels on the 24th to the 25th of September 2018. And of course, we've agreed this with our Austrian colleagues also. I invite our Bulgarian, Austrian and Romanian colleagues to get together soon and start the work that the JPSG Rules of Procedure entrust to the Presidential Troika. And as with Mrs. It's getting late, Svetanov has said, we wish those presidencies very well. So it remains for me to thank the national parliamentarians who worked so hard between the two meetings to achieve all of this consensus. I'd like to thank my fellow members of the European Parliament. They don't be thanked so much. Thank you for being here and contributing so well. The national members of Parliament, to all the staff and volunteers, but finally, what is it? It's okay. And finally, finally to the Bulgarian presidency and to our hosts. Really, I think it's a very well-organised meeting. And I really am grateful that we got the rules done. That was the main thing. Thank you very much. And we're now on a secure footing. And finally, on an emotional point, I would like to say thanks, Rob, for all your work. That's what I know. You've only been thanked about 50 times. And I'll probably see you next week. But thank you. Europol is what it's all about, and I think you have all done extremely well today. So thank you very much, colleagues, for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Svitanov. And a good journey home to all of you.